streeters, women.
Well, can't stand around all
I
day.
knew one once. Striking-looking girl, tall, you know.
And the veal chop is done with rosemary. It's funny, thought you'd gone to Canada.
When John Cleese publicly went to war with the network that made him famous, everyone thought he was mad. It started with a ban and ended with Cleese calling BBC cowards. The network claimed it was protecting viewers, but Cleese fired back, saying today's generation had simply grown too soft. What could drive a comedy legend to clash with the BBC itself? You might think that was Fawlty Towers' biggest scandal. Well, you thought wrong, because this show broke more censorship codes than any sitcom of its time. And now we're revealing why. To understand how Fawlty Towers ended up at the center of one of Britain's biggest television controversies, we need to rewind back to the chaotic birth of the show itself. Before the bans, before the outrage, it was just an odd little sitcom BBC didn't even want to air. Yet buried inside its polished comedy was one scene and one character that would change everything. But before we delve into who he was and what made his character so controversial, let's talk about one scene from Fawlty Towers that never made it out of the scripts. The lost anniversary scene. Basil, Sybil, and the flirtation that never was. For decades, fans of Fawlty Towers thought they had seen it all. Every sharp insult, every slammed door, every moment of Basil's spectacular nervous breakdowns. The show's perfection lay in its chaos, its balance between farce and discomfort, and its razor-sharp writing that squeezed every ounce of humor from human awkwardness. With only 12 episodes ever made, each one has been picked apart and celebrated, frame by frame. So when, in 2022, a lost scene from a Fawlty Towers episode surfaced, a scene no one had ever seen or even known existed, it felt like a piece of television history had come back to life. And, of course, it was classic Fawlty Towers, awkward, inappropriate, and hilarious in that perfectly British way. When a rehearsal script for the Season 2 episode The Anniversary surfaced at auction, fans actually didn't expect much until they opened its worn pages and discovered something extraordinary. Hidden inside was a deleted sequence that had never been filmed, a moment that added surprising emotional depth to Basil and Sybil's famously fraught marriage. For years, The Anniversary had been remembered as one of the show's most chaotic triumphs. In the original episode from 1979, Basil Fawlty tries to redeem himself after forgetting his wedding anniversary the year before by secretly planning a surprise party for Sybil. But in true Fawlty Towers fashion, everything collapses spectacularly. When Sybil believes he's forgotten again, she storms out, and instead of admitting the truth, Basil digs himself deeper into chaos. He convinces Polly to disguise herself in Sybil's clothes and pretend to be bedridden upstairs because, of course, that's the most logical plan in Basil's world. What fans never knew was that the original draft ended with a twist that could have changed everything. The lost scene takes place after Sybil unexpectedly returns to find the guests ready to leave. Basil scrambles to explain the disaster away, and somehow the party resumes. But things take an unexpected turn when Sybil, slightly tipsy, forgives him and even starts flirting, dressed in what the script describes as a frilly, sexy robe. Meanwhile, Polly, Manuel, and the chef, Terry, are still hiding in the bedroom, forcing Basil to sneak them out unnoticed. In the final bit of slapstick chaos, Basil ends up dangling from the wisteria outside their window, the perfect image of a man literally hanging by a thread in his own marriage. So why was it cut? After all, it didn't breach any moral standards, nor was it inappropriate for television. According to those who've studied the show's production, The scene was likely removed before filming because it leaned too far into bedroom comedy, a tone Fawlty Towers avoided. The show's humor thrived on tension, not intimacy. Basil and Sybil's marriage worked as a kind of comic battlefield, a war of sighs and insults. So introducing flirtation or physical comedy of intimate nature might have undermined that balance. It was also the 1970s, an era when BBC sitcoms walked a fine line between wit and propriety. What read as harmless innuendo on paper could easily be judged as too cheeky once it reached the screen. There is also something captivating about imagining how it might have played out. Basil scrambling to escape his own wife through a window, only to be caught mid-act. It's exactly the kind of physical absurdity that made Fawlty Towers iconic. You can almost picture John Cleese, lanky, frantic, and half out the window muttering excuses while Sybil watches in amused disbelief. It would have been a rare role reversal. For once, Basil wouldn't be ranting or raging, but caught off guard and embarrassed, while Sybil, typically the exasperated observer, would have been the one in control, savoring the moment. The rediscovery of this lost scene reignited debate among fans and television historians alike. Some questioned whether it might have reshaped how audiences perceived Basil and Sybil's marriage because their relationship had long been perceived as loveless. They were just two people bounded together by routine and irritation. This scene would have suggested something more subtle, a faint spark of affection buried beneath the sarcasm and resentment. It would have added a new dimension to the series, reminding us that Fawlty Towers was never just about slapstick chaos. It was also about people trapped in jobs, relationships, and their own unyielding pride. In many ways, The Anniversary, Lost Scene, captures everything Fawlty Towers stood for. It's funny, awkward, and slightly inappropriate, but it also reminds us how carefully John Cleese and Connie Booth shaped every moment of the show. Nothing was wasted, nor was anything random. Every joke had purpose, and every silence carried weight. The decision to cut that scene wasn't a mistake. It was an artistic choice that kept the show's tone intact. Still, it's hard not to smile imagining what it would have looked like, Basil dangling from a window, trying to escape his own wife's affection. Today, when we talk about lost scenes or missing footage, it's usually about deleted moments that were never meant to see the light of day. However, this one feels different. It's a glimpse into an alternate version of Fawlty Towers, one where Basil and Sybil weren't just sparring partners, but a couple still capable of surprising each other. Maybe that's why the discovery struck such a chord, because it didn't change the show's legacy, but it reminded everyone why that legacy still matters. Even 40 years later, Fawlty Towers continues to reveal layers of comedy, timing, and emotion that most sitcoms can only dream of. In the end, the Lost Anniversary episode scene doesn't need to be filmed to be remembered. It's funny and ridiculous, but also touching all at once.
Can I do it? Oh, thank you. I've forgotten what it was.
And maybe that's the beauty of it. Sometimes, the best moments in television aren't the ones we see on screen. They're the ones left behind, waiting to be rediscovered years later to remind us how timeless great comedy really is. But if you thought a flirty lost scene was shocking, wait until you hear what actually made BBC panic. A moment so controversial, it nearly erased Fawlty Towers from history. Major Gowan's racist rant. The scene that time couldn't ignore. Fawlty Towers was a 1970s British sitcom set in a dysfunctional seaside hotel run by the perpetually frustrated Basil Fawlty and his long-suffering wife, Sybil. The show's brilliance lay in its chaos, a sharp, farcical look at British manners, class pretensions, and social awkwardness. Among its quirky residents was Major Gowan, a bumbling, elderly ex-military man who spent most of his time at the hotel bar, lost in memories of the good old days. To many viewers, he seemed like a relic of a bygone era. He seemed harmless, confused, and faintly comedic. But in the original uncut version of the episode The Germans, the Major delivers a monologue so laced with racist language that it shocked even audiences of the time. It all began while chatting with Basil about a cricket match. He recalls an encounter with the West Indies team and, with unsettling ease, he began using racial slurs that would never be broadcast on television in today's day and age. It's a moment that halts the humor entirely, exposing how casual and accepted such prejudice once was in certain parts of British society. To be clear, the scene was never meant to glorify that kind of language. Writers John Cleese and Connie Booth intended it as satire, a critique of an older generation embodied by characters like Major Gowan, men hopelessly out of step with a changing world. The humor, at least in theory, was meant to be at his expense, and his ignorance was the punchline. However, satire is a delicate art. What once passed as sharp social commentary in the 1970s won't always translate the same way today. For modern audiences, hearing those slurs even framed as irony doesn't feel witty or insightful. Instead, it feels jarring and even uncomfortable. When Fawlty Towers first aired in 1975, British audiences were still adjusting to the new era of television that was incoming. The country was changing. Immigration was reshaping its cities, and conversations about race were becoming louder as the day passed. Comedy at the time often reflected these tensions, but not always in a progressive way.
And what part of Ireland are you from then? Burnt cork?
Shows like Till Death Us Do Part and Mind Your Language were popular for the same reason. They used racial stereotypes for humor, though sometimes under the guise of mocking them. Fawlty Towers, however, was smarter because its humor usually punched up, not down. This is why the Major's rant stands out as such a jarring moment, because it felt like the show stepped out of its own rhythm to remind us just how casual bigotry once sounded, even in polite conversation. So, what exactly did the Major say? Did he really use racial slurs, or was the scene blown out of proportion? At first, it sounded like one of his usual rambling monologues, nostalgic, confused, and slightly outdated, but then the words changed the air in the room. He remembers taking her to watch India play at the Oval, where she made a racist remark about the team, and shockingly, he tried to correct her with another. But the shocker is that the scene wasn't written to fuel racism. In fact, it was a far cry from what the writers intended. But as with all forms of miscommunication, the viewers only saw things from one perspective: theirs. To them, this scene was highly insensitive and offends every principle of racial respect. But the hidden motivation behind that scene was that it was meant to be a satire. The dialogue was a careful placement by the writers to draw attention to the Major's ignorance and the casual racism of older generations. John Cleese and Connie Booth had carefully portrayed the polite prejudice of 1970s Britain, but their humor could not be appreciated because of viewing sensitivities. But what makes the scene unforgettable isn't the slurs themselves, but how out of place they sound now. It's a verbal fossil, a reminder of how far humor and society have had to evolve. When Fawlty Towers first aired on 19 September 1975, it faced no bans or official backlash. The series even quickly became a national hit, celebrated for its sharp writing and farcical humor. So why no controversy back then? This was because in the mid-1970s, British broadcasting standards and public sensibilities were very different. The show was widely understood as satire. Its targets were out-of-touch characters like Major Gowan, Not the marginalized groups they mocked, so outrage was minimal, and the episode continued to air freely for decades. However, the consequences came much later as cultural attitudes evolved. When the BBC revived the series in 2013, broadcasters began to reassess the content through a modern lens. That same year, BBC had to air an edited version of The Germans, cutting Major Gowan's racial slurs for a family time slot, sparking debate about censorship versus context. However, it didn't end there. In June 2020, UK TV temporarily pulled The Germans from its streaming platform, a move that sparked immediate backlash, especially from John Cleese himself. Never one to stay quiet, Cleese condemned the decision, arguing that the episode had been misinterpreted. It wasn't endorsing racism, he said, it was mocking it. Major Gowan's rant, according to Cleese, was written to expose the absurdity of outdated prejudice, not to celebrate it. By cutting or censoring the scene, he argued, the network stripped the story of its satirical intent and underestimated viewers' ability to understand irony. After widespread public debate, UK TV eventually reinstated the episode, but with a content warning noting offensive language and outdated attitudes. It was a compromise, a way to preserve a piece of television history while acknowledging its flaws. Watching The Germans today is a strange experience. On one hand, it's still a masterclass in physical comedy because of Basil's nervous hysteria, the slapstick timing, the absurdity of trying to hide a war from German guests. On the other hand, there's an undeniable tension under the laughter. Knowing that this part of the episode was cut makes one wonder what else television has brushed under the rug. For longtime fans, though, the Major's rant doesn't define Fawlty Towers. It's just one uncomfortable reminder of how much times have changed. Fawlty Towers is still one of Britain's most loved comedies because of how sharp, chaotic, and brilliantly written it is. However, that one scene is a reminder that even classics can carry the uncomfortable truths of their time. Comedy doesn't exist in a bubble. It reflects the people and the world that created it. What once felt like clever satire can, years later, sound like it's crossing a line. But the controversy didn't end there because a decade later, BBC stepped in quietly, trimming scenes and rewriting history to make Fawlty Towers safe for families. Or so they thought. BBC, censorship for family viewing. How Fawlty Towers was quietly cleaned up. When people think of Fawlty Towers, the first thing that comes to mind is Basil Fawlty, the frantic and sharp-tongued hotelier perpetually on the brink of collapse. The series became a cornerstone of British comedy, celebrated for its razor-sharp timing, biting wit, and brilliantly orchestrated chaos. However, beneath the laughter lies a story only few fans know. For 21st century audiences, one of the show's most iconic episodes carries a quiet controversy, not for what was shown, but for what was later changed. Long before the rise of social media outrage or cancel culture, the BBC had already intervened, trimming moments it deemed too risque or inappropriate for family viewing. And in doing so, it subtly rewrote a small but significant piece of Fawlty Towers' history. The episode in question is The Germans, a fan favorite that gave viewers Basil's unforgettable line, "Don't mention the war." It's a scene so iconic it became a part of pop culture itself. The scene has Basil stumble through a minefield of awkward gaffes while desperately trying not to offend his German guests. The humor is bold, uncomfortable, and deliberate, however. That isn't what truly stirred controversy. The real shock came from someone else entirely, and it was none other than the bumbling Major Gowan, a relic of Britain's bygone military class, embodying an era of fading manners, misplaced pride, and deeply outdated language. The passage of decades had shifted cultural boundaries, and by the early 2010s, when the BBC prepared to rebroadcast Fawlty Towers during its 7:30 p.m. family slot, that controversial section had to be removed. In 2013, without fanfare or public debate, the BBC quietly trimmed the episode. The cuts weren't dramatic. It was just a few seconds removed from the dialogue, but the effect was huge. Major Gowan's most offensive lines, including the N-word and his clarification about West Indians, were gone. The edit was so clean that most casual viewers probably never noticed anything missing. What they got instead was the safer, more palatable version of the classic that was still funny, still full of chaos, but without the jarring reminder of Britain's racist past. What made the censorship unusual, though, was that it happened with John Cleese's approval. Cleese, who co-wrote the series with Connie Booth, reportedly agreed to the edits, understanding that the humor of the 1970s didn't necessarily translate into the 21st century. To him, the intent of the original scene had always been clear. The Major wasn't meant to be admired. He was meant to be mocked. The problem was that intent doesn't always survive the test of time. Without context, without that shared understanding of satire, those words risked sounding real, and real prejudice doesn't belong in family viewing hours. For some, this quiet censorship symbolized a shift in how we handle classic television. It wasn't about erasing history, but about reframing it for modern audiences. BBC wasn't canceling Fawlty Towers. They were making it fit for a world that had moved on from its casual acceptance of certain language. Still, the decision stirred debate, with some arguing that the cut distorts its message. Others, on the other hand, saw it as a necessary act of responsibility, a reminder that entertainment should evolve as society does. When the BBC edited Fawlty Towers in 2013, it wasn't trying to rewrite history. It was admitting how much the world had moved on. The humor that once got laughs now feels like a relic. Basil Fawlty didn't need the Major's language to be funny. His chaos was timeless. And maybe that's the beauty of it. Sometimes, what gets cut tells the story better than what stays. When the BBC trimmed Fawlty Towers for family television, it was just the beginning. Decades later, the show faced a far bigger test, one that would shake streaming platforms worldwide. Streaming removal and the warning label. When Fawlty Towers met the modern world. In the summer of 2020, something happened that world-changed overnight, and it was the passing of George Floyd. It didn't just ignite protests, it triggered something deeper, a collective reckoning that reached every corner of society. People began asking deep questions about race, history, and the things they once accepted without a second thought. From corporate logos to old films, everything was being re-examined under a sharper, less forgiving light. Unexpectedly, the conversation also reached Fawlty Towers. It wasn't that audiences had forgotten its humor, however. Something had shifted. The lens through which people watched had changed, and what once seemed like satire now felt like something that needed unpacking. The flashpoint came in June 2020, when UK TV, the network now under BBC Studios, pulled the episode The Germans because of how controversial it was. According to UK TV, the reason for the removal was that the episode contains racial slurs, so they were taking the episode down while they reviewed it. Within hours, the news spread, and while it wasn't banned forever, it was still enough to spark a global reaction. Some people applauded the move as they saw it as a necessary step in cleaning up old content that hadn't aged well. Others, on the other hand, saw it as an overreach, a sign that political correctness had gone too far. For those who hadn't seen the episode, the removal suddenly made it the most talked-about piece of British comedy that year. Viewers argued, critics debated, and amid the noise, one voice cut through it all, and it was John Cleese himself. When he spoke, everyone stopped to listen. John Cleese did not let the story die down with polite statements. Within hours, he fired off a string of blistering messages on social media, calling the decision to review the episode cowardly, gutless, and contemptible. He also accused those who pulled the episode of being a mix of marketing people and petty bureaucrats. He pressed the point in interviews with clear and almost theatrical bluntness. Speaking to Australian press, Cleese argued the episode's tone was exactly the opposite of what critics claimed. He said the outrageous words come from characters who are meant to be mocked, not celebrated, and that handing their lines to the audience without that context is what exposes prejudice. Cleese's language was sharp and theatrical. He described the removal as a stupid decision and framed it as a failure to understand satire, insisting the jokes were aimed at ignorance, not the targets of racism. The tone of his reaction was clearly anger. The same voice that built Basil Fawlty now used outrage to defend the intent behind the joke, and soon news outlets were quoting his tweets and interviews across the globe, turning the episode review into an international debate almost overnight. 2 days later, UK TV brought the episode back online, this time with a label warning viewers about potentially offensive content and language. It was a small, unobtrusive sentence at the start of the show, but it marked an important shift. Instead of pretending old television was harmless, it invited viewers to watch critically, to laugh, but also to think. It showed how even the most beloved comedies weren't immune to cultural evolution. In the 70s, Fawlty Towers had been considered fearless, as its humor was sharp enough to cut through social norms. However, in the 2020s, it became a reminder of how humor ages and how society's tolerance changes with it. For many fans, Cleese's outrage read as a defense of artistic intent, while for others, it only sharpened the question of how to treat old comedy in a new world. Either way, his intervention was the point the story pivoted on. What had been a tidy removal became a hurried, very public conversation about satire, context, and who gets to decide what stays on our screens. The online temperature spiked fast as well. Threads on Reddit and comment sections were filled with anger, amusement, and bewilderment as viewers picked sides. Some longtime fans saw the takedown as an attack on a shared comic touchstone, calling it cancel culture and insisting the joke was always on Basil, not the Germans. Others said those arguments missed the point, that the episode contains language and attitudes that hurt real people, and that leaving it unflagged would be tone-deaf to a moment when many were demanding change. Voices rose beyond forums and spilled into every corner of the internet. Comment sections filled with disbelief, eye rolls, and heated defenses of the show. One viewer wrote, "And Cleese is right. It's quite obvious they're making fun of the Major. It's like Tropic Thunder. They're making fun of RDJ's character. And even then, why remove it now? The N-word has been an unacceptable slur since forever." Another added, "No one asked for this." This isn't why people are protesting. Just like with Gone with the Wind, a company has decided to pull it even though no one was asking them to. There's already an edited version which Cleese approved of in 2013. For some, those words summed up the exhaustion of a culture that seemed too eager to censor. They saw the removal as misplaced guilt, a company reacting to outrage that didn't even exist. But even then, others felt differently. It's hard to overstate how perfectly this moment captured the cultural tension of 2020. The year wasn't just about protests in the streets, it was about reckoning across media and entertainment. Networks were quietly pulling episodes of The Simpsons, 30 Rock, and Little Britain for similar reasons. humor once dismissed as harmless was being re-examined through a new lens, one more sensitive to what such jokes represented. In that climate, Fawlty Towers was bound to come under review. Still, UK TV's compromise showed a path forward. The episode didn't need to be taken out completely, it just needed perspective. The warning allowed viewers to see Fawlty Towers as both a time capsule and a teaching moment. It was a relic of its era, brilliant yet imperfect. It acknowledged that comedy can be both genius and flawed, daring and dated. Cleese's frustration, however, was understandable because for him, the intent had always been crystal clear. The Major was a caricature of ignorance, a fading relic of empire, not a hero to emulate. However, Cleese also recognized that humor doesn't age evenly, and what once mocked prejudice can later sound like it's echoing it. The difference lies not in the writer's intent, but in the audience's world. This tension between satire and offense, between intent and impact, is why Fawlty Towers continues to spark debate. The show was built to make people laugh at the absurdity of bigotry, but as society evolves, those same words can land differently. What once seemed harmless now stings because the world has changed, and perhaps that discomfort is progress itself. When the Germans finally returned with its new disclaimer, something fascinating happened. Viewers revisited it, some nostalgically, others with fresh eyes, and the conversation shifted. It wasn't just about whether the episode should exist, it became about what it meant. What does this moment tell us about comedy? About how far we've come, and about how satire can both age brilliantly and badly at once. The laughs are still there. It is sharp, chaotic, and unmistakably British. Basil's manic energy, his frantic balancing act between charm and catastrophe, still lands with perfect timing. His desperate attempts to appear civil while offending everyone within arm's reach remain as hilariously disastrous as ever. The Major's words, meanwhile, continue to jar, and they should. They remind us that laughter, when placed under the microscope of time, often reveals the cracks of a changing society. And now, with that brief content warning preceding the episode, audiences aren't just watching a sitcom, they're witnessing a cultural artifact, a preserved moment from an era when humor danced on far riskier edges. In a strange way, the controversy breathed new life into Fawlty Towers. It reignited conversations about the purpose of comedy, whether it should comfort, confront, or challenge. The show's temporary removal and eventual reinstatement didn't diminish its legacy. They recontextualized it. They reminded the world that humor evolves, and that the sharpest jokes sometimes need to be revisited to be understood anew. Looking back, it feels less like censorship and more like a cultural checkpoint, a pause for reflection rather than erasure. It wasn't about rewriting history, but about reframing it responsibly. Fawlty Towers didn't disappear. It adapted. It proved that even the most iconic television can grow with its audience, learning to exist in new times without losing its bite. Today, The Germans remains both funny and flawed, a perfect contradiction that defines great art. It opens with a warning now, a subtle but powerful gesture reminding viewers how far we've come. Because truly, great comedy doesn't endure by pretending the world hasn't changed. It endures by daring to show us exactly why it had to. So, what do you think? Should controversial scenes be hidden or shown with context to teach us where we've been? Was the BBC right to censor it, or did they erase an important piece of television history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.